Historians, assuming we survive to have historians, will debate the exact moment humanity's fate changed. Was it when the first Cerulean scout ships penetrated our solar system, when their initial transmission crackled across global communication networks? Or was it that perfect, impossibly mundane Tuesday when everything we knew about our place in the universe collapsed like a poorly constructed house of cards? Let's back up a bit. The year was 2047. Climate change had transformed Earth into a patchwork of environmental chaos. Coastal megacities floated on massive stabilization platforms. The Arctic had become a geopolitical chessboard of resource extraction. Humanity had already fought itself to the brink of extinction multiple times, only to pull back at the last moment with a combination of technological innovation and sheer stubborn resilience. We were a species that had learned to turn near-apocalyptic scenarios into mild inconveniences. The Cerulean Collective didn't know this. How could they? Their intelligence gathering was thorough but fundamentally limited by a critical misunderstanding of human nature. They saw data points, statistical probabilities, technological capabilities. What they couldn't quantify was human unpredictability. Their first scout ships entered our solar system with the quiet precision of a mathematically perfect algorithm. Sleek biomechanical vessels that looked like they'd been grown rather than constructed, with hulls that seemed to shimmer and pulse with an organic intelligence. Each ship was a marvel of engineering that would make human scientists weep if they weren't busy trying to figure out how to blow it up. The initial transmission came at 0347 Coordinated Universal Time. Global communication networks lit up simultaneously, a digital symphony of panic and curiosity. Inhabitants of planetary designation E487, classified as Terra Prime in Galactic Quadrant 7 Epsilon. This communication is a formal declaration of territorial acquisition. Your planetary resources have been assessed. Your civilization's technological level has been evaluated. Surrender is the most statistically favorable outcome. The message was delivered in perfect emotionless English. Every language on Earth simultaneously translated with mathematical precision. A show of technological superiority that was supposed to inspire immediate capitulation. Instead, it inspired memes. Within minutes, social media exploded. Late-night comedians got the comedy material of a lifetime. Conspiracy theorists ran victory laps. Government officials looked like they were simultaneously trying to not soil themselves and appear calm. The Ceruleans hadn't anticipated human humor as a defense mechanism. Their initial fleet consisted of 7 primary vessels, each capable of obliterating entire continents with less effort than most people expend making breakfast. Massive constructs that defied conventional physics, powered by energy sources that human scientists would spend decades trying to understand. They expected fear. They expected submission. They did not expect the 203rd Irregular Warfare Battalion, stationed in what used to be Nevada, now a carefully managed ecological restoration zone that looked more like a mad scientist's playground than a traditional military base. The 203rd was less a traditional military unit and more a collection of the most dangerous, creative problem solvers humanity could assemble. Commander Jack Reyes was not your typical military leader. A veteran of 3 global conflict zones, with a doctorate in adaptive systems engineering and a personality that could charitably be described as caffeinated chaos, he represented the best of human unpredictability. When the first Cerulean landing craft touched down on the carefully prepared ground near Groom Lake, a location that had long been the subject of alien conspiracy theories, now turned into the most elaborate military trap in human history. Reyes stood on a reinforced ridge, munching on an energy bar and looking like a park ranger who had accidentally wandered into an interdimensional war. "Gentlemen," he spoke into his communication array, his voice calm and slightly amused, "I do believe our guests have arrived." The landing zone was a masterpiece of human preparation. What looked like pristine desert was actually a complex network of underground systems, sensor arrays, and defensive mechanisms that had been decades in the making. Not because anyone truly expected an alien invasion, but because preparing for the impossible was essentially a human national pastime. The Cerulean troops were technological marvels, 7-foot-tall biomechanical entities that moved with a precision that made traditional robotics look like children's toys. Exoskeletons that could analyze and adapt to threats in microseconds. Weapons that could vaporize city blocks with less effort than most people expend making toast. They were perfect. Mathematically perfect. Which in human terms meant they were about to have a very bad day. The first indication that something was wrong came when the landing craft's sensors began reporting impossible readings. Ground composition shifting. Thermal signatures that made no sense. gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist. By the time they realized it was a trap, it was already too late. Humanity's first message to the Cerulean Collective wasn't a diplomatic communique, it wasn't a declaration of war, it was a demonstration of creativity, of spite, of a fundamental inability to go quietly into any good night. The universe was about to learn something important about the inhabitants of a small blue-green planet. We don't do statistically probable, we do hold my beer and watch this. The first 24 hours after the initial Cerulean landing were a masterclass in human chaos management, which is to say it was simultaneously a complete disaster and a bizarre work of improvisational genius. Global Military Command had spent decades preparing for various apocalyptic scenarios: asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, pandemic outbreaks, zombie apocalypses. Alien invasions had always been the least serious entry on those contingency lists. More of a running joke than an actual threat. Turns out those late-night planning sessions fueled by terrible coffee and even worse conspiracy theory documentaries were about to become humanity's greatest asset. The 203rd Irregular Warfare Battalion's initial assault against the Cerulean landing force was less a traditional military engagement and more a performance art piece of tactical destruction. What the aliens had assumed would be a simple ground conquest turned into a nightmare of adaptive warfare that defied every known military doctrine in the galaxy. Commander Jack Reyes stood in the Tactical Command Center, a converted underground facility that looked like a cross between a high-tech bunker and a college dorm room that had been hit by a technology tornado. Holographic displays flickered with real-time data, multiple communication channels buzzed simultaneously, and in the center of it all, Reyes looked simultaneously exhausted and weirdly excited. "All right, people," he spoke into the communication array, "let's show these walking spreadsheets what happens when you mess with a species that invented both nuclear weapons and reality television." The initial Cerulean ground force consisted of 500 biomechanical troops, perfectly synchronized, technologically superior, each unit capable of processing combat scenarios faster than human brains could comprehend. They had no concept of human improvisation. The Nevada landing site became a proving ground for humanity's most bizarre defensive strategies. Underground tunnel networks, originally designed for everything from military research to speculative mining operations, transformed into a labyrinth of unexpected destruction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the 203rd's lead technological strategist, had spent the last decade developing what military brass had mockingly called impossible defense systems: adaptive nanotechnology, quantum entanglement communication networks, electromagnetic disruption fields that could theoretically turn advanced technology into expensive paperweights. "They're running predictive algorithms," Rodriguez muttered, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces, "which means we need to be fundamentally unpredictable." The first wave of Cerulean troops discovered this the hard way. What looked like a straightforward territorial conquest became a surreal landscape of technological warfare, robotic defense systems that changed tactics mid-engagement, terrain that literally seemed to fight back, defensive mechanisms that appeared to break the laws of physics. One Cerulean tactical report would later describe the engagement as statistically impossible, which to human ears sounds like a challenge. The global response was equally chaotic. Major cities transformed overnight, infrastructure adapted. Every human technologies from advanced satellite networks to centuries-old mechanical engineering principles was weaponized. In Tokyo, underground metro systems became mobile defense platforms. In Sao Paulo, favela communities repurposed industrial equipment into makeshift weapon systems. In Lagos, a network of tech entrepreneurs turned communication networks into a real-time adaptive defense grid. The Ceruleans had assumed a hierarchical, centralized approach to human resistance. They discovered instead a decentralized network of adaptation that resembled less a military and more a global, improvised organism. Commander Reyes watched the initial engagement reports with a mixture of professional assessment and barely contained glee. "They expected a traditional military response," he commented to Rodriguez, who was busy recalibrating some horrifically complex piece of technology. "Instead, they got the most dangerous thing in the universe." Which is, Rodriguez didn't look up from her work. A species with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Cerulean communication networks began reporting anomalies, defensive systems that shouldn't work, technological adaptations that violated known physical principles. resistance patterns that made no mathematical sense. Humanity wasn't just fighting, we were having fun. By the end of the first week, the Xerelian collective would receive their first genuine surprise, not just resistance, not just survival, but the dawning realization that they might have made a terrible mistake, and humanity was just getting started. The problem with being an advanced alien civilization is that you start to believe your own propaganda. The Xerelians had spent millennia collecting technological achievements like most species collect participation trophies. Each advancement was meticulously documented, categorized, and filed away in vast databases that stretched across multiple star systems. They had no concept of human innovation, which is less about careful planning and more about what happens when caffeine, desperation, and pure batshit creativity collide. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's primary laboratory was located deep beneath what used to be the Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. Once a pinnacle of scientific research, it now resembled a cross between a mad scientist's playground and a salvage yard that had been hit by a technology hurricane. "We're not just building weapons," Rodriguez would later explain in her after-action reports. "We're creating an entirely new approach to technological warfare." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday because, apparently, Tuesday was humanity's designated day for rewriting the laws of physics. These Xerelians had been systematically destroying traditional communication and power infrastructure. Their strategy was elegant, precise, and fundamentally flawed. They assumed that by removing centralized systems, human resistance would collapse. They didn't understand that humanity had been preparing for systemic collapse for decades. Climate change, political instability, and global resource wars had forced humanity to develop distributed networks that could survive almost anything. What looked like vulnerability was actually an incredibly robust, almost organic technological ecosystem. Rodriguez's team had been working on a project that military strategists had initially considered impossible, an adaptive technological interface that could literally learn and modify itself in real time. Not just software menace, a true hybrid system that blended biological adaptation with technological innovation. The first prototype looked like something that would make most scientific review boards spontaneously combust. A mess of quantum processors, organic neural networks, and repurposed satellite components that seemed to defy conventional engineering principles. Commander Jack Reyes stood in the laboratory, a half-consumed energy drink in one hand, looking like he was simultaneously fascinated and slightly terrified. "Explain this to me, like I'm a 5-year-old who's also a special forces operator," he said. Rodriguez grinned. Her hair was a mess of static electricity, her lab coat covered in what looked like 3 different types of unidentifiable residue. "It's a big smart computer that learns how to punch aliens in the metaphorical face." The system Menace, which they unofficially nicknamed Chaos, Cognitive Hybrid Adaptive Operational System, represented a fundamental shift in technological warfare. Traditional computer systems processed information, Chaos consumed it, adapted it, and then weaponized it. Its first major test came during the Battle of New Mexico, an engagement that would later be studied in military academies across multiple star systems. The Xerelians had developed what they considered the ultimate electronic warfare platform, a network of quantum communication relays that could intercept, analyze, and neutralize any technological system within milliseconds. On paper, it was unbeatable. Chaos saw it as a challenge. What followed wasn't just electronic warfare, it was a technological dance so complex and beautiful that future historians would debate whether it was a battle or performance art. The Xerelian system would attempt to infiltrate human networks. Chaos would not just block the invasion, it would learn from it, understand it, and then use that understanding to create entirely new defensive mechanisms. Imagine a system that didn't just respond to threats, but anticipated them. That could literally rewrite its own operational parameters in microseconds. A technological immune system that saw external interference as an opportunity for growth. Across the globe, similar innovations were happening. In Lagos, a network of young engineers developed a communication system that could rebuild itself faster than it could be destroyed. In Shanghai, quantum encryption techniques turned communication networks into living, breathing entities that could camouflage themselves. The Xerelians had approached this conflict with the assumption of technological superiority. They were about to learn a fundamental truth about humanity. We don't just adapt, we transform. Commander Reyes watched the first successful Chaos test with a mixture of professional assessment and pure, unadulterated joy. They thought we were limited by our technology, he said to Rodriguez, who was busy making adjustments to a system that looked like it had been designed by a caffeine-fueled octopus, but our real weapon has always been our ability to look at a problem and say, "Hold my beer." Rodriguez didn't look up from her work, but a slight smile crossed her face. "Welcome to humanity, ladies and gentlemen, where impossible is just a suggestion." The Xerelian Collective was about to receive a masterclass in human innovation, and they weren't going to enjoy it one bit. Strategic historians would later debate the exact moment when the Xerelian Collective realized they had monumentally underestimated humanity. Was it during the Battle of New Mexico, the quantum network incident, or that bizarre moment when a group of Australian engineers weaponized an entire continent's worth of solar infrastructure? The truth, as always with human conflicts, was wonderfully complex and utterly ridiculous. By the 6-month mark of the invasion, Earth had transformed, not just militarily, but fundamentally. Every system, every infrastructure, every technological network had been reimagined as a potential weapon. Cities were no longer just urban centers, they were adaptive, living defensive platforms. Take Sydney for example. What used to be a picturesque coastal metropolis was now a technological fortress that would make most science fiction writers weep with joy. Skyscrapers had been retrofitted with electromagnetic pulse generators, underground transit systems became mobile command centers, even the city's famous botanical gardens had been transformed into a sophisticated biological research facility, focusing on adaptive defense mechanisms. Commander Jack Reyes stood in the Global Coordination Center, a facility that looked like it had been designed by a team of network engineers who had simultaneously discovered caffeine and chaos theory. Holographic displays flickered with real-time data from every continent. Communication networks hummed with an energy that felt almost alive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez entered, carrying what appeared to be both a tablet and what might generously be called an experimental quantum coffee machine. "We've got something," she said, which with her was always a dangerous statement. The Xerelians had been methodical in their invasion strategy. Eliminate centralized communication, destroy traditional power infrastructure, neutralize military command structures, a strategy that would have worked perfectly against any traditional civilization. They did not understand that humanity had long stopped being a traditional civilization. The turning point came during what the Xerelians had planned as a decisive strike against Earth's remaining technological infrastructure. A massive assault designed to finally break human resistance. They targeted what they believed was a critical communication hub in the Australian outback. Satellite data suggested a massive technological concentration, perfect strategic target. What they didn't realize was that the hub was actually an elaborate trap that had been months in preparation. The assault force consisted of 3 primary battle groups, approximately 15,000 biomechanical troops, technological assets that represented the pinnacle of Xerelian military engineering, weapon systems that could theoretically sterilize entire planetary regions. They were, to use a technical term, royally screwed. The first indication that something was wrong came when their initial sensor sweeps returned inconsistent data, terrain that seemed to shift, communication networks that appeared and disappeared like technological mirages, electronic warfare signatures that made absolutely no sense. Commander Marcus Adenuga, leading the African Continental Defense Network, watched the engagement unfold with a mixture of professional assessment and barely contained excitement. "They're running predictive models," he commented to his tactical team, "which means we need to be fundamentally unpredictable." The trap was beautiful in its complexity. What looked like a communication hub was actually a multi-layered defensive system that was part technology, part biological adaptation, and part pure human improvisation. Quantum entanglement communication networks that could rebuild themselves faster than they could be destroyed. Adaptive nanotechnology that could transform entire sections of terrain in microseconds. Defensive systems that didn't just respond to threats, meaning they anticipated and manipulated them. The Xerelian assault force found themselves in a technological nightmare. Weapon systems that worked perfectly in laboratory simulations became useless. Communication networks collapsed and reformed in patterns that defied known physical principles. One Xerelian tactical report would later describe the engagement as a violation of fundamental mathematical probability. Humans would later describe it as Tuesday. The engagement lasted less than 3 hours. When it was over, the Xerelian assault force had been completely neutralized. Not destroyed, not defeated in a traditional sense. Completely and utterly rendered non-functional. More importantly, they had been humiliated. Commander Reyes watched the final tactical reports with a smile that was equal parts professional satisfaction and pure unadulterated joy. They thought we were limited by our technology, he said to no one in particular. But our real weapon has always been our ability to look at a problem and say, hold my beer. The Azarillian collective was about to learn a fundamental truth about humanity. We don't just fight wars, we turn them into an improvisational art form. And we were just getting started. The Azarillian High Command convened in what could only be described as a technological marvel of a war room. Holographic displays stretched across multiple dimensions, showing tactical data that would make most military strategists weep with technological envy. Hundreds of consciousness-linked administrators from across their galactic empire, all connected in a perfect mathematically precise network of decision-making. They were about to make their most critical error. By the 9-month mark of the invasion, Earth had become something entirely different. Not just a planet under siege, but a living, breathing, adaptive organism of resistance. Every city, every network, every piece of infrastructure had been transformed into a potential weapon system. The final confrontation would not be a traditional battle, it would be a war of pure, unadulterated human innovation. Commander Jack Reyes stood in the Global Coordination Center, a facility that looked like it had been designed by a team of network engineers who had discovered both caffeine and chaos theory simultaneously. Holographic displays danced with data from every continent, every ocean, every remaining satellite network. Dr. Elena Rodriguez entered, carrying what appeared to be both a quantum computer and what might generously be called an experimental coffee machine that could potentially solve world hunger as a side project. "We've got a plan," she said, which, coming from her, was always a statement that simultaneously inspired hope and terror. The Azarillians had spent millennia perfecting their invasion protocols. Thousands of years of technological advancement, countless simulations, perfect mathematical models of planetary conquest. They had one fundamental flaw in their strategy: they viewed humanity as a singular, predictable entity. They were about to learn their mistake. The global resistance had spent the past 9 months doing something far more profound than simply fighting. They were reimagining what resistance could mean. Every system, every network, every piece of technology was being transformed. In Mumbai, a network of young engineers had developed a communication system that could rebuild itself faster than it could be destroyed. Quantum entanglement networks that danced around traditional communication principles like digital ballerinas on quantum caffeine. In Sao Paulo, entire favela communities had transformed themselves into adaptive manufacturing centers, turning industrial waste into advanced defensive technologies. 3D printing facilities that could produce complex weapon systems faster than traditional factories could produce a single component. The African Continental Defense Network, led by Commander Marcus Adenuga, had developed adaptive terrain manipulation technologies. Entire landscapes that could shift and transform, turning invasion routes into technological minefields that defied conventional warfare principles. The Azarillian invasion force gathered for what they considered the final assault: 3 primary battle groups. Approximately 50,000 biomechanical troops, technological assets that represented the pinnacle of their military engineering, weapons systems that could theoretically sterilize entire planetary regions in milliseconds. They were, to use a technical term, monumentally screwed. The first indication that something was wrong came when their initial sensor sweeps returned completely impossible data: terrain that seemed to breathe, communication networks that appeared and disappeared like technological ghosts, electronic warfare signatures that made quantum mechanics look like a simple children's game. Their primary invasion route, carefully calculated through millions of predictive algorithms, suddenly transformed. The Australian outback became a living, breathing defensive system. What looked like empty deserts suddenly bristled with technologies that shouldn't exist. Adaptive nanotechnology that could transform entire sections of terrain in microseconds. Defensive systems that didn't just respond to threats, they anticipated and manipulated them. One Azarillian tactical report would later describe the engagement as a fundamental violation of known physical and mathematical principles. Humans would later describe it as Tuesday afternoon. The battle wasn't just a conflict, it was performance art. A technological dance so complex that future civilizations would debate whether it was warfare or some bizarre form of interspecies communication. Azarillian weapon systems, printed signed to be perfectly adaptive TALV, found themselves confronted with technologies that changed faster than they could analyze. Defensive networks that weren't just reactive but predictive, systems that learned and transformed with each microsecond of engagement. Commander Reyes watched the tactical displays with a smile that was equal parts professional satisfaction and pure, unadulterated joy. "They thought our limitation was our technology," he said to Dr. Rodriguez, who was busy recalibrating something that looked like it could potentially solve world hunger and create interdimensional portals as a side project. Rodriguez didn't look up. Our real weapon was never our technology, she muttered, fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. It was our ability to look at a problem and say, "Hold my beer." The engagement lasted less than 6 hours. When it was over, the Sauralian invasion force had been completely neutralized, not destroyed in a traditional sense, completely and utterly rendered non-functional. More importantly, they had been comprehensively humiliated. The Sauralian collective was about to learn a fundamental truth about humanity. We don't just fight wars, we turn them into an improvisational art form, and we were just getting started. Historians would later debate the precise moment of humanity's greatest triumph. Was it the moment the last Sauralian ship fled Earth's solar system? The instant their galactic communication networks collapsed? Or that beautifully absurd moment when a group of Australian engineers essentially weaponized an entire continent's worth of solar infrastructure? The truth, as with most human stories, was simultaneously more complicated and simpler than anyone could have predicted. The Sauralian collective's final transmission was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. Received simultaneously across multiple global communication networks, it read less like a surrender and more like an existential crisis written in complex mathematical equations. Commander Jack Reyes read the transmission in the Global Coordination Center, surrounded by a team of scientists, military strategists, and what could only be described as the most dangerous collection of problem solvers humanity had ever assembled. Elena Rodriguez stood beside him, still holding what appeared to be a device that was simultaneously a quantum computer, a coffee machine, and potentially a portal to another dimension. "They're asking for clarification," Reyes said, his voice a mixture of professional disbelief and barely contained humor. The transmission was essentially a 500-page report attempting to mathematically quantify how a technologically inferior species had completely dismantled the most advanced invasion force in galactic history. It read like a doctoral dissertation written by a computer having an existential breakdown. Key passages included gems like statistical improbability does not adequately describe the observed human response mechanisms. Adaptive capabilities exceed known biological and technological parameters by approximately 976.3 standard deviation units. And the personal favorite, recommendation, avoid future engagement. Possibility of complete systemic failure, approaches 99.999999% confidence interval. The global response was, predictably, quintessentially human. Social media exploded. Meme generators worked overtime. Late-night comedians discovered a comedy goldmine that would fuel their careers for decades. But beneath the humor was something profound. The invasion had done something unexpected. It had unified humanity in a way no previous global challenge had managed. National boundaries had become meaningless. Technological innovations shared across former enemy lines. Communities that once fought each other now collaborated with an intensity that would have been unimaginable before the invasion. The Australian team that developed terrain manipulation technologies collaborated directly with Brazilian network engineers. The quantum communication experts from Mumbai worked seamlessly with Canadian defensive strategy teams. African manufacturing centers shared real-time innovations with European research facilities. Humanity hadn't just survived, we had transformed. Commander Marcus Edenuga, representing the African Continental Defense Network, summed it up best during a global broadcast. They came expecting a simple conquest. Instead, they discovered something far more dangerous. A species that doesn't just adapt, a species that sees every challenge as an opportunity to redefine what's possible. The Sauralian collective would spend decades, perhaps centuries, trying to understand what had happened. Academic institutions across their star systems would analyze the Earth conflict, attempting to extract some meaningful strategic lesson. They would fail, because the fundamental truth about humanity cannot be quantified, cannot be reduced to mathematical equations or predictive algorithms. We are a species that looks at the impossible and sees a challenge, a species that turns limitations into innovations, a species that, when told the odds are impossible, simply responds, "Hold my beer." In the Global Coordination Center, Dr. Rodriguez finally set down her quantum coffee interdimensional device. "Well," she said, with a smile that could only be described as dangerous, "that was interesting." Commander Reyes laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to encompass the entire absurd, beautiful journey they had just survived. "Interesting," he repeated. That's one way of putting it. As the last Itsorian ships disappeared from Earth's solar system, humanity looked up at the stars, not in fear, but in anticipation, because we were just getting started.